Fed decision day and Oracle earnings. Oracle earnings being placed mysteriously right after the Fed decision. Trump and Larry Ellison, best of buddies. Is this a coincidence? I think not. All right, we're going to dive into the charts. But first, my name is Gareth Soloway, Chief Market Strategist here at VerifiedInvesting.com. I'm a technician. Technical analysis is my thing, but I'm also logical. And logic is what technical analysis breeds. And when you notice every Fed decision after it, there's always some announcement that tries to keep the markets from going down. Now, again, it's not that we necessarily know the markets are going to go down on the Fed, but the president apparently is always putting something right after, whether it's an announcement between NVIDIA or an AI or a big jobs report or something positive, something that he knows is going to give the markets a lift or at least attempted lift. It's being placed purposely after the Fed decision, whether it's right after, meaning after hours today, or sometimes the next morning. Either way. All right, folks, we're going to get into the charts here. Let's start with the S&P 500. And what we see here, again, is the S&P is struggling, right? We're struggling going into the Fed decision. The Fed decision is expected, or the Fed is expected to cut by 25 basis points, but remain very hawkish. In fact, the data is showing that essentially the Fed Funds Watch tool is saying this is the last rate cut for Jerome Powell during his tenure as Fed chairman. All right. And remember, in May, there will be a new Fed chairman, likely one that is more dovish. However, make sure you remember that the Fed decision to cut, raise, or do nothing is a vote. So just because the Fed chairman may be being pushed by the president to cut 25, 50 basis points, the vote amongst all voting members, it has to be in that direction or it can't happen. So I think that's an important aspect that many people don't understand. The Fed chairman can't just unanimously say, hey, we're going to cut rates. Now, granted, do they have influence? Absolutely. But it's not a done deal. Okay, so going back to the charts, we notice the S&P remains inside of this wedge pattern. This wedge pattern on the S&P clearly shows us that the upside is somewhat limited. And again, you might say, well, why can't we break above this level? And the answer is you absolutely can, but a good technician that is based on logic looks at the parallel and says, wow, every time we hit the lows here, we get a big bounce. And the parallel line to that goes to the highs of the bull market, and it rejected it there, and it rejected it here, so we can't assume it's going to break out. In other words, the upside on the S&P over the next, let's say, I don't know, the next couple weeks into year end, even if we do get a rally, it's probably limited to about 2% until we get into that trend line. Now, again, the question here is, will we see upside on the back of the Fed? I do think there is a chance of it at least being neutral to positive, and I'm going to tell you why. Two things. Number one, the Oracle report after the bell could be and likely will be positive. And again, you can argue a million times over if this is right, but it is the Fed gives its report. It's essentially a cut and probably a hawkish statement. It is not a coincidence that ultimately they are reporting after hours. Remember, Larry Ellison, who runs and owns a majority of Oracle, he was a main contributor to Trump's election and campaign. He's a buddy. He's actually been one of the key players that's looking to take over TikTok, right? Because he's buddy with Trump. And it's not a coincidence that this date was chosen. Remember, a company gets to choose when it reports earnings during that quarterly period. And this was a specific day, the day after or the day of the Fed, but after the announcement that Larry Ellison chose to report. And remember, if we look at the chart of Oracle here, the chart of Oracle has had a bounce, right? But again, it's still way off of, this was last earnings right up here. Incredible move, and it's come way down. And so again, I would argue that the odds are it's going to be a very good report, because otherwise, if it was a bad report, he wouldn't have picked after the Federal Reserve decision. And in other words, his buddy Trump, President Trump, would not have said, hey, could you do your report and by the way, wink, wink, make sure it's a good report, right? And listen, I'm not a big conspiracy theorist fan, but at the same time, I'm also very cognizant of the relationship and how much importance President Trump places on the stock market and essentially making the Fed into almost a lame duck. Again, last Fed decision or the Fed decision before, we saw NVIDIA do a deal with OpenAI. That was the morning after it was announced, after the Fed decision. Prior to that, we saw another thing. So it's been a very planned Fed reports. Jay Powell, we know President Trump doesn't like him and wants to replace him, but hasn't been able to fire him, but his tenure is coming to an end. So it's been very key to notice that there's always a positive announcement after the Fed decision to basically make the Fed decision old news. Right? It's about changing the narrative from what did the Fed say, what did the Fed do, to, oh, look at this new shiny object, right? And then that's what we're seeing here, at least in my humble opinion. Now, listen, the thing that we can't predict as we look at the chart of Oracle is you can't predict how the market will react. So Oracle could report a great quarter and the market overall could say, yeah, but what about this one thing? We don't trust it or whatever. And listen, Oracle could go down. But I would argue that the odds are it's going to be a good report due to the fact of when the report's coming out purposely after the Fed. And then also, again, knowing Larry Ellison's relationship to President Trump. Now, with members of Smart Money Stocks and ETFs, my swing trade service, we've been long in this since the low 200s, right? So we're in the money. I have thought about taking it off the table prior to earnings, but considering we have a cushion because we're in the money, and listen, I could be totally wrong, and it could dump out on earnings, but I'm going to probably roll the dice at least for an after-hours move. Maybe I'll dump into the after-hours move if we get that move. Now, would I buy it here? Probably not, just because, again, I don't have a technical setup. If we look at the chart, I trade purposely on technical analysis. There was a reason why this right here was a no-brainer buying opportunity, right? I mean, again, perfect gap window, extreme oversold. There was a positive divergence on the RSI. All of these factors had me jumping in here. Now, again, the question is, will it go up? I think the odds favor that. But remember, it's all probability based, and that's going to come down to whatever Oracle says, whatever Larry Ellison says about them and their AI plays. Essentially, are they only relying on OpenAI for their money? Because that was the problem last time. And we know OpenAI is not looking so hot. Now, the question is there a government contract? Think about that. Maybe that's the hidden gem here. Maybe there's something with the government because, again, they can't. The last earnings report was great. It had this huge backlog, but ultimately it fell sharply off of that. And you can see that in the chart. I mean, this thing traded as high as 346 on the back of earnings, and it came all the way down to 200, right? I mean, that's actually 190, believe it or not. But the key is, that was because it was all OpenAI. And we know OpenAI, I mean, how do you rely on one company for all your projections? But now imagine if they come out today and say, oh, we have deals with these companies plus the government. And listen, I literally have no insider information. What I'm saying is totally speculative on this front, but it's also kind of an educated guess, right? It's an educated guess. And listen, I don't think Oracle goes up sizably like listen, I'm not saying Oracle's going to go up 30% again like it did 40% on last earnings. But again, do I think it's going to be a positive and maybe go up 5 or 10%? I think that could happen here on the back of earnings. All right. So again, chart-wise, let's look at charts. Where is first resistance? Well, needless to say, we've already hit first resistance on Oracle here. Notice this low right here. If we drag that over, very clearly, that's why we stalled out right here around the 221, 222 level. If it busts through, I could see this trading as high as this high pivot around 234, maybe higher, but we'll watch and see. If it does decline, we obviously know there's major support around 190 here, this former pivot low right here. All right. So again, the positive for me, at least with members of Smart Money Stocks and ETFs, which is at verifiedinvesting.com, my swing trade service there, is that if it does fall, we have that cushion of being in the money. So yeah, we give up gains, but at least it's gains and not losses, ideally. All right, guys. So that's what I wanted to discuss there. Going back to the S&P again, S&P, remember, has limited upside. So even if we get a Santa Claus rally into the end of the year, it's limited to about 2% upside, which is not a lot into year end. Obviously, if we break above this and confirm, then the story totally changes based on technical analysis. But right now, that is the short-term top, and downside is much greater. I mean, again, if you look at from here down to here, from here, and we didn't even reach that high, but down to here, right? These are all levels. By the way, you want to see something interesting here. If we take the high of the bull market and we connect it to this pivot high, look at where we pulled back to. This is just something really cool. Again, it does tell us why we bounced where we bounced. Like here, you take this high, you connect it to the high here going into the liberation sell-off from tariffs, and then look at when we broke out. Where did we fall to? Right there. Isn't that cool? I love technical analysis, guys. I think it's just the coolest thing ever. Now, the key for us is if this line ever breaks. So downside would be to here. If this line breaks, that's where you get the bigger move down to this level around 6,100 on the S&P. But again, resistance, support 1, support 2, and again, if we get above here, resistance 1, which is around 7,000 on the S&P. By the way, that's a new all-time high. Then we start talking about, okay, how high can it go after that? So we just have to be flexible in terms of the TA. But the video today was, number one, going over the levels on the S&P, but ultimately going over this Oracle announcement. Coincidentally, right after the Fed today, let's think about that. All right. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. I much appreciate it. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.